Yep. Oh,
lose to the
right.
Cardinals. Yeah, lose to the Panthers. I remember the Panthers one, and then lose to the Bears. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, because the last second kick against the Ravens game, I remember that, and obviously I was there for the 49ers game. So okay, yeah, okay. Let's end the Bengals the Bengals game at the very end of the season, which was hilarious to watch.
Yes.
Sorry, we'll stop having nostalgia for the 09 season.
Down memory lane.
Yeah. Eddie asks, would you participate in a fantasy league that scored entirely on the finalized PFF grades?
I did do that actually way back. The issue is that I'm not a very organized person logistically, and I was the one who was organizing the league, and I had to do it manually. And so the league lasted for like 5 weeks, and then I was like, okay, I'm just screwing all this up.
Like
I just kind of collapsed.
I have too many spreadsheets open to be able to continue to do this.
Right, yeah. So I did do that. I think it's a really fun idea. I think you can't do it off of the current 2.0 PFF thing, like with the Madden 100 thing. You have to do it off of a cumulative grade. So that's the biggest issue. But I've done it. It's fun.
Galileo asks, the Bears dominated the Rams offense last year, and their scheme is similar to the Vikings. What adjustments do the Vikings need to do to make to counter?
Yeah, I would argue that the Rams offense is not as similar as you'd expect, given that they're both wide zone style West Coast offenses. You hear that, you see, the motion sweeps, and you think they're probably the same, but the Vikings actually do have a more diverse running game, than the Rams, which is not to say that it's better or worse. We've seen some teams with really incredibly diverse running games not get off the ground. We've seen, just like the Rams, have simple running games and make a lot happen for them. But it is a more diverse running game, which means it can have more answers to the kinds of things Chicago does. Obviously in the interview that you just heard with Lauren Cox, the depth at defensive tackle is going to be a bit of an issue for the Bears, and that might open up some creases for the Vikings in the running game. But I think that primarily it's just going to be the fact that I think the Vikings have higher quality receivers than the Rams do. I think that, for example, I think the way people treat Cooper Kupp, right now he's a little bit overrated. I think that Brandon Cooks is a really tremendous receiver who's a little bit underrated, but is not quite the same level of talent as Diggs or Thielen. So I think that that's going to help. I think that the way the Bears cornerbacks are playing this year, like we mentioned in the interview with Lauren, does provide some of its own opportunities. And then, like Lauren mentions, I think that the capabilities you have to attack those linebackers, I think they're more obvious this year than they were last year as weaknesses in the Bears defense. So I think that there's a couple more opportunities here, and then you don't really have to worry about kind of the schematic similarities, because I don't think those are as strong as to create those kinds of worries.
All right, Kai asked the question, does the team need Cousins to win the game with his arm, or will either the running game or the defense win the game for them if they win at all?
Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by the defense winning the game for them. Like, obviously, if the defense scores a bunch of points by itself on like pick sixes and stuff like that, and then doesn't allow any points, obviously the defense wins the game. But if we think, hey, the defense holds them to 10 points or 14 points or whatever, and then the offense squeaks by with 15, did the defense win it for them? What if the final 8 points come on a 2-minute drive at the end of the game where Kirk not only scores throws the scoring touchdown, but also like runs it in for 2? Does that mean the offense won the game? Because the defense still only held them to 14 points. That's kind of difficult to parse out, because how the game ends will kind of define, usually what the narrative coming out of the game is. And the fact that the Vikings weren't able to score for like 3 quarters until that final 2-minute drive is not going to be discussed as much, right? But the defense in that scenario, I would say, did more to help win the game than the offense, despite that last-minute drive. So I kind of don't know what that means. I will say that I think it is likely that the Vikings will have to rely a lot more on Kirk Cousins to win this game. Even though there are some weaknesses, like we mentioned, with the injuries at defensive tackle, that should allow some more lanes to open up in the running game. I don't think we can expect Alvin Cook to average 6.5 yards carry for the rest of the year. And I think this is one of those games where that comes back down to earth a little bit. and Cousins is going to have to keep the offense on schedule, or if the offense is off schedule because of, like, say, a tackle for loss, he's going to have to dig the Vikings out of it. And because of that, I think Cousins will be more crucial to this kind of game than, say, the Raiders game, right? So where Cousins averaged like 8.3 yards per attempt, but was clearly not, the most significant figure in that game. So yeah, I think that a significant amount of the burden is going to fall back onto the quarterback. But I do think that the defense will do a lot. Like, I think if the defense allows 21 points, A, that would be a huge surprise. But B, you could say that the defense kind of let the Vikings down, because even though, like, the average is 24 points or something like that, and they held them below NFL average, I think the defense is expected to do better than just better than average, especially against, Mitch Trubisky. So I'll expect the defense to hold them to very few points, unless something like a pick six, a special teams touchdown, which is very possible because they've got Cordero Patterson, or a field position problem occurs. I still think that offensively you're going to rely a lot more on Kirk.
Yeah. Next question is from John Belk, who asks, seems like there's always some short side note about O'Neill is playing well at the end of discussions about how disastrous our line still is. How well is he playing exactly? Are we looking at a potential franchise left tackle, or just a pleasantly decent tackle? How has he improved so far from being a pretty unheralded day 2 pick?
That's actually a really good question. So I'll say that among, like, say, right tackles, he's underrated, right? Like, he's no Lane Johnson, right? He's no Ryan Ramczyk. So among, like, right tackles, there's, like, some level of, like, lack of notoriety. People don't talk about right tackles all that much. But I'll say that he's playing at a relatively high level. So, PFF has him as, like, the 10th best tackle in the league. I wouldn't put him there based off of what I saw. I'll say that he is currently in the discussion to be in the top third or the top quarter, maybe somewhere around there, of right tackles. And because he's putting in above average performances at a consistent rate, which at the beginning of the season is difficult to do. So some of these really good right tackles are, getting dinged for one game where he hasn't had the bad game yet, so he's not getting dinged yet. But he is playing pretty well. And he's the best performing offensive lineman that the team has. He's being asked to do a lot more run blocking than pass blocking. We've talked about that a bunch this year. So we'll kind of see what happens when more pass blocking responsibility falls on his shoulders, because of the two areas of his game, that's the area that's not quite as strong. He's a little bit of a better run blocker than a pass blocker. But we'll see. I think he's punching above his weight, which is great. But, whether or not we can say he's more than just well above average, I don't know yet. I'll say that he's not a cornerstone, definitely lock him in there kind of guy. And, next year, if the Vikings want to move him to left tackle, I'll probably be against it, just because, it's almost just as important to be good on the right side, and I wouldn't want to screw up his footwork. And it's just worth it to invest in a left tackle.
Yeah. Next question is from Matt Nelson, who asks, what has been the difference for Kendricks this year? There was grumbling last year that he was underperforming despite splash plays, but this year he's doing great. Has something changed?
I mean, he's just making fewer mistakes, right? Because like you mentioned, last year, he made a bunch of splash plays, but then, he'd take a bad tackling angle, or he'd be, 2 steps behind in coverage on a tight end down the field, or he'd bite too much on play action, and not read his keys. And he'd miss some tackles too. And right now he's actually missing a couple of tackles. Like, his missed tackle rate is a little bit high, but it's fine because of all the splash plays he's making. He's not making a bunch of these other kinds of mistakes. He's following the running back to the hole, and he's meeting them there. When he's making contact with the running back, he's making it much closer to the line of scrimmage than he did last year. He's a little bit more hesitant. And I remember last year, one of the things I was really confused by, and I still don't know why the case is, he was maybe the most instinctive linebacker coming out of that draft, and I thought he was a first-round worthy pick. And in fact, I wanted the Vikings to pick him, trade down, pick him in the first round, and then, pick a cornerback in the second round. And they did the opposite, but they were able to get Kendricks in the second round. I thought it was a steal. And the reason is because he was the most instinctive linebacker in the draft. So last year, when he wasn't playing fast, and by that I don't mean he was physically slow, but he was reacting to stuff slowly. I was a little bit confused, and that's not happening here. He's anticipating plays before they develop and blowing them up. So that, I think, is the biggest change, because there's still some issues with tackling form. There's some issues with strength, which has been a weakness of his, but primarily he's doing a great job getting to where the play is before the play develops. So that, I think, is the primary change.
Also from Matt Nelson, the question is, Vikings Twitter likes to act like Zimmer is some old school curmudgeon that would prefer to run a wing T offense, never pass, and lean on his defense. He clearly understands offense considering how well he schemes to stop it. Why does he absolutely refuse to get involved with the offensive side of the ball? Why doesn't he use his defensive knowledge to help improve the offense?
I would say that he does. Like, I think that he sits in on game planning meetings for the offense, and he talks about, kind of what principles might work and what might not work. But he doesn't spend time studying opposing defenses, so his input in that capacity does get limited. There's only so much time he has, and he wants to spend it studying other team offenses to blow them up. And I think there's something about the type of thinking it takes to disrupt versus the type of thinking it takes to create. And he's a disruptor, right? I mean, that's what defenders do, right? Is that they disrupt the kind of offensive play designs. And so, seeking out weaknesses versus building strengths, it's just like its own type of thinking. So it's not really the same style of thinking, but he does sit in on offensive game plans and he does provide input. What's interesting is that, a lot of people talk about how much he likes to run the ball, which is kind of fair given how he treated DiFilippo when DiFilippo was here as the offensive coordinator. But, I mean, his defenses have always been better at stopping the pass than they have been at stopping the run. And, of course, after games, he's like, we got to stop the run better. But he never sacrificed his ability to stop the pass in order to stop the run. And he was much more aggressive about moving to nickel when defenses needed to move to nickel. So, it's very clear from a defensive perspective, he understands that passing does kind of move the league. So this idea that he's just married to the run offensively is interesting. I'm not saying it's unfair, but it's interesting given what his defensive priorities have been. And maybe it's just this cognitive dissonance thing, kind of like how coaches hate it when they're on defense and the other team decides to go for it on 4th and 1. But then when they've got an opportunity to go for it on 4th and 1 in the same situation, in the same, field position, they don't do it. Right. And it's very interesting because if they just thought of it like, well, if the other team did this, which one would scare me more? They might change their decision making. So it might be related to that, right? Where he hates allowing completed passes or allowing teams to pass easily without harassment and is willing to give up the run. But on the other side of the ball, he kind of preferred to run it. Maybe that's the case, but it strikes me as odd that he would sell out this much for an offense that runs the ball more. I think really we are just a little bit too bought into these two games where the Vikings have been up 21-0. They passed the ball more than they ran in the Atlanta Falcons game before the score went up to 21-0, but a lot of those passes were called back because of penalty. And so it looks like a mismatch, but they still ended up passing the ball a little bit more than you'd expect, given the final rundown of runs to passes. So, he's fine throwing the ball in standard down situations. The Vikings are going to run the ball more than a typical team does, but they're still going to pass it more by the end of the year than they're going to run it. At least that's what I think. So I don't think it's so old school that he's curmudgeonly and all that. I do think he gets involved in offensive meetings, but I do think he spends his resources into the type of thinking that he's comfortable with. So that's kind of my long-winded half answer to the direct question you asked.
Brian Jellerson asks, do you think the NFLPA will bite on the 17-game season, or is this more of a bargaining chip? Also, would you guys prefer a 17-game season or an 18 weeks with 2 byes?
So this was reported by The Athletic that the NFL didn't want to pursue an 18-game option. Some owners were opposed to it after it had been proposed. They didn't like the idea that players would be able to bargain 16-game minimum or maximum for players. And that 16-game maximum would have meant that fans would have bought tickets to games where they expected to see stars, and then the stars would be sitting because it's one of their 2 designated games to sit. So they didn't like that idea. which I get. Like, I think that strategically, it's kind of a cool idea that you have to figure out, who sits when, whether or not you're just going to give up the first 2 games by playing your backups, or if you're going to use kind of strategic, development time or whatever. But